Today on Locked On Phoenix Suns, James Jones, Matt Ishbia, they told us back in May that they were basically going to stand pat, tinker on the margins, believe in continuity, and after most of the dust has cleared on the offseason, well, it looks like that's exactly what they did. So, allow me to make the case for holding steady. Let's go.
You are Locked On Suns, your daily Phoenix Suns podcast, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
And we're back. This is Locked On Phoenix Suns, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. I'm Brendon Kleen, your host, as well as a credentialed media member who has covered the Suns for the past 7 seasons and the host of the Just Basketball Show. Welcome in. Thank you for making Locked On Suns your first listen to kick off your Tuesday, one day closer to Summer League. I'm excited. I hope you are. Hit follow or subscribe if you have not already. We're free and available on all podcast platforms, including YouTube. All you got to do is hit that button, stay in the know, get locked onto the Phoenix Suns each and every day, Monday through Friday, all off season long. Become an everydayer right here with the show. Today's episode is brought to you by FanDuel, America's number one sportsbook and the official sportsbook of the Locked On Podcast Network. As the playoffs wind down across sports, they're not quite what we want them to be this time of year. The sports just aren't there. But this summer, FanDuel's hooking everybody up with a boost or a bonus every day. That's right. There's something for everybody every day, all summer long at FanDuel. Visit FanDuel.com to get started. Okay. Let's roll here. So, the Suns have one roster spot left after 2 draft picks, 2 free agent signings, 2 re-signings, well, 3 in O'Neal, Bull, and Lee. We heard on Monday morning that the Suns were in on Haywood Highsmith, the sort of combo forward defensive athletic guy from Miami. He ended up going back to the Heat on more than the Suns could have offered. Apparently even got a personal call from Damian Lillard as the Bucks pursued him as well. But we'll see what that final roster spot ends up entailing. Clearly it's not set in stone. Might end up just being Josh Okogie, but for the most part, you're looking at a team where the top 7 from last year's playoffs in the big 3, O'Neal, Allen, and Nurkic, I guess that's 6, and then Bull we'll call 7, are basically coming back. On top of that, the additions that they've made have been pretty standard, right? 2 rookies that fill needs, 2 veteran minimum role players who basically kind of fill in the gaps and add some depth and experience and raise the floor. That's running it back for now. So today we're going to make the case for why that made sense. Tomorrow I'll look at maybe the pessimistic angle a little bit as far as why it did not make sense to do that. But I think there's a lot of value to what they did, and so I want to start with the positive and start with the rose-colored glasses here a little bit when it comes to their offseason here in Phoenix. So, number one, the case for standing pat, maybe the Nurk plus pick trade that we all argued about and debated and concocted in our brains just wasn't there. Maybe it just wasn't there, right? I look at the summer so far, and we just haven't seen a trade like that. Frankly, the closest thing moved Devontae Graham's $3 million guaranteed to Charlotte for 1 second-round pick. We saw the Nuggets do the same thing to move Reggie Jackson with 3 second-round picks. He was at about $6 million. The Mavs sort of did it with one trade in they put Josh Green to the Hornets for some sort of price and then ended up getting Klay Thompson. The same thing sort of happened with the Spurs, where with the Kings, where that's probably the closest. And in that case, the Spurs were the ones that were being on the receiving end of the DeRozan Chicago sign and trade situation, where the Spurs take back Harrison Barnes, kind of a Nurkic type contract where he's an older player, doesn't have a ton of value on the court, and is a little expensive. And then the Kings gave up a 2031. That sounds familiar, right? Pick swap unprotected in order to send Barnes to the Spurs and be able to get back DeRozan. However, even that's not a one-to-one comparison to what the Suns would have been looking at with Nurkic, because one, that was a sign and trade, which the Suns are not allowed to do. And two, part of how that all ended up shaping out is the Kings were able to give DeRozan a bigger contract than what Barnes had, which is, again, not something the Suns would legally be allowed to do under those second apron rules. So there's not a one-to-one comparison. One other option that doesn't involve Nurkic but could have been utilizing this 2031 pick, which is still in the Suns' treasure chest right now, is what Minnesota did, right? Where they just sort of created a pick out of thin air high up in the lottery that they wouldn't have had access to elsewhere by trading 2030s, a pick, or I'm sorry, I think a swap in 2030 and then a pick in 2031 either way, those two assets together, which the Suns couldn't quite do themselves, but maybe you could have moved up from pick number 22 where the Suns started out into the lottery if you gave up the 2031 pick. But of course the question becomes, for who, right? So that trade didn't happen anywhere else in the NBA. These, the Bucks didn't get off of Brook Lopez the way that they might have wanted to. We didn't see a, Michael Porter Jr. trade from the Nuggets and they're not even in the second apron, but, like we might have thought. The Celtics, of course, weren't in that camp at all. They're re-signing everybody. And then the Wolves, so maybe it wasn't there. That's a good case for why you do this, is you can't make something out of nothing, and if it was going to be there, the value probably would have been terrible. I think in the league right now, you're also, we'll kind of get there later, but the point is, the league, you're seeing the value of cap space for teams be a little bit more valuable than it used to be, just by way of taking on the money of teams like the Suns so that those teams can be more flexible. And so there's no need to have your move be to take Nurkic back if you might like some of the other options that are similar out there, like what the Spurs did with Barnes, or what the Hornets did in a few spots, or the Pistons did in a few spots. That can be better. But on the other hand, the Suns maximized everything else, which is another feather in the cap, another sort of a W for the people who kind of wanted to run it back a little bit here, which is that they started the draft with pick 22. They ended it with Ryan Dunn, Oso Ighodaro, and 2 extra second-round picks. I mean, that is 4 assets out of 1. Pretty incredible. They did trade some other stuff along the way, but that's pretty nice. I mean, they got it. They should get an A for the draft. They added experienced, high-floor depth pieces to kind of cobble together and protect the big three a little bit, just from a workload standpoint and a floor standpoint. And they stayed older while adding youth, if that makes sense. And here's what I mean by that. The average age last season heading into the year for the Suns was 28.1. They were like the 4th or 5th oldest team in the NBA. That had been in the league for a while. This year, Royce O'Neal is obviously there, so that sort of changes things. But they got Plumlee, they got Morris. So all of that will be able to just sort of start the season off in a good spot with stability. But also, they now have some developmental projects like Dunn, Ighodaro, and the two-way guys, and maybe after Summer League, somebody like Boo Buie or whatever will become another two-way option. So the trade they might have So if you had told me that heading into the summer and then you said, so all in all, they ended up standing pat, I kind of would have understood it. The other case for standing pat is that the Suns' on-court product, their best players together, worked pretty well. I'll break down how it could look with even more time together, and what the optionality is that they now have after their moves this summer, coming up next. First, today's show brought to you by BetterHelp. BetterHelp is making therapy easier, more accessible, and on your schedule. Really no excuse not to go with it. Comparison is a thief of joy for a lot of us. It's easy to envy other people's lives. It might look like your best life. As I've said before, therapy does not have to be about an emergency or something severe or scary or painful in your life. It can just be about coping, setting boundaries, empowering yourself, dealing with everyday life. If you're thinking of starting therapy, give BetterHelp a try. It's online, convenient, flexible, and suited to your schedule. All you got to do to get started is fill out a brief questionnaire, get matched with a licensed therapist, and then you can pop around, switch therapists anytime for no additional charge until you find the right person. So stop comparing and start focusing with BetterHelp. Visit BetterHelp.com/LockedOnNBA today to get 10% off your first month. That's BetterHelp, HELP.com/LockedOnNBA. And we're back. Alrighty, so the other case for the Suns standing pat, if I'm being optimistic, being positive, trying to see the vision here, is that the core worked. The big three together was pretty successful. We've talked plenty about from just after Christmas when Bradley Beal returned from the injuries that he had been dealing with. The Suns were on a 50-plus win pace. There's all sorts of stats about when, they all played, what that record was, when they all scored 20-plus, et cetera, et cetera. They, big picture, had a lot of the context and they had a lot of the things you would want to see from a team built this way, which is that when their guys were on the court, they were really hard to stop. They were really hard to beat. And when all of those players scored well and were in a rhythm together, I'm not going to say it was impossible to beat them, but they were one of the better teams in the NBA. Numbers-wise, they had a 124 offensive rating and a +7 net rating with the big three on by themselves. That's not as good of a number as you honestly would have liked to see necessarily, but we know that when you add Grayson Allen into that, the offensive rating was absolutely off the charts. And even the starting lineup, the kind of, let's say the playoff starting lineup when Grayson was healthy that first round series of the big three, Allen and Nurkic, had a 127 offensive rating and a +10 net rating. Those are very, very good numbers. Now, I'm not going to sit here and lie to you and say they're the most elite numbers you could possibly find. They aren't. But they're a good place to start from and, hope that chemistry, health, depth can make that even better when these guys are playing off of each other at a higher level and, maybe at their physical best when they are playing. Now, Matt Ishbia said in his post-season press conference back in May, he said, quote, "One of the things we talked about at the beginning of the year," so think back to last October, is, quote, "Can we get our guys to play 60 to 65 games together? I think we played less than 40. That continuity does affect it. Now, it doesn't mean that's why we lost. It just means it's something we have to be aware of." I couldn't find the exact quote of Ishbia, or I believe it was Ishbia, who said that their plan was to keep the starting five together. But I found that quote, and that speaks to it, right? And so kind of take them at their word. If they believed, and remember, we didn't know it. We didn't know the Suns had this Ayton trade in their back pocket all last summer. But as much as you can say, oh, they didn't have training camp together, and the Damian Lillard Ayton trade ended up being this kind of bomb that went off right before everything started up in the fall. The Suns kind of knew it. Now, the timing and the time together of all of that, of course, matters. I'm not going to pretend like that was insignificant, but just think from a team building standpoint, the Suns knew Nurkic was going to be their starting center for a lot longer than the rest of us did. They didn't know the Allen part of it. They thought it might be Victor Oladipo, which is sort of crazy to think considering he didn't play last season, but they believed in Nurkic for a full 12 months now, let alone whatever happened in the season, and then he had a pretty decent season, and a lot of the numbers would tell you, I know Eubanks being so bad was part of why the numbers look better for Nurkic, I get that, but the numbers would tell you that him plus the big three was really, really positive stuff, and then of course we know Allen had a great year. So what they went ahead and did is they basically, so far, have kept it together. And they built more optionality into the structures that big three is going to be in, right? Just think right now, as things currently stand, the Suns can run a big three, a lineup featuring the big three plus a point guard in Monte Morris and any sort of other fifth guy that you want. They can run the big three in a smaller version with more either defense or shooting or whatever they want to do, where they could put, depending on if you call Bol small ball, you could put him out there. You could put Durant as maybe the biggest guy and have Ryan Dunn and, let's say, Royce O'Neal out there as the other two guys around the big three, and kind of have that, nobody smaller than 6'5", nobody bigger than 6'10" type of mix in there. You could go huge and go the big three with two bigger guys. Let's say Bol and Nurkic, or Royce and Nurkic, or Dunn and Nurkic, or whatever. The goal is to get more out of the big three with better depth and defined roles for the rest of the players. And frankly, more defined roles for the big three. I know that sounds dumb, but you just listen to the interview that Kevin Durant did with Vince Goodwill on Yahoo Sports this week that Brandon Duenas and I talked about on Monday's episode here on the show, where, we focused on the trade aspects of it and him refuting all the rumors and everything. But in that interview, he talked about a role. He talked about how he's comfortable filling any sort of role. To me, with just focusing on KD for a second, the problem with him, like Brandon said this on the show yesterday, and we didn't have time to dig too deep into it because we had a lot of stuff to get to, but he said Durant had a great defensive season. I think Durant had a very good defensive season. I think he had a great 2 or 3 months on defense in the middle of the season when the team got healthy, but before that end of the year, last month or so, when things started to get wonky. So let's say from like late December to, let's say, just after the All-Star break, I thought Durant was great on defense. The rest of the time, I think he was just being pulled in a lot of different directions, and he wasn't able to do that consistently. Be a on-ball stopper, be an off-ball helper, be a great defensive rebounder. Those things weren't always possible because he's having to take a bunch of shots this game, and he's spacing the floor this other game, and whatever the case may be. Obviously, we know from a ball handling standpoint, there's a lot to sort out with Booker and Beal, and then whatever role, Allen or Monte Morris or the centers now are going to play in terms of initiating. And then what are the matchups and what's kind of the pecking order on the defensive end. These are all things we didn't know going into last season. We still might not know for sure, but with Morris, with Plumlee, with a step forward from Bol, with Lee coming back as a shooter, Allen, O'Neal, I think we have a better idea of what everybody will be doing 1 through 10, 1 through 15 when they're on the court. Here's what James Jones said in May. Quote, "It's important to remember that we're starting with 6, 7, 8 really good core players. When you're talking about building on the margins, I think we have more than enough to do that effectively. I mean, I think that's been proven out, right? He told us exactly what was going to happen, and we all just, again, I'm totally good if you still think they haven't done enough. I'm just trying to say that this was their goal, and they pretty much achieved it. They turned the draft pick into multiple contributors and multiple assets. They got very solid players on the minimum market. They re-signed the players we all knew were the most important ones to bring back. Check, 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 Now, let's look forward, because obviously just saying stand pat is great because this and that, that's all theoretical. Things can change as the season goes along, but I actually think that's part of what the Suns are betting on, is that they get more time to evaluate this whole thing before they rush into a decision. I'll tell you what I mean. Coming up next. We all love sports, but sometimes during the summer, they just fizzle out, and unfortunately, they're not quite what we want them to be. FanDuel is stepping in to fix that problem. They let you keep the sports going whenever you want all summer. All you got to do is open the app, dream up bets anytime you're in the mood. And this summer, FanDuel is hooking up all customers with a boost or a bonus daily. That's right. There's something for everybody every day all summer long. So head over to FanDuel.com and start making the most out of your summer. I have told you, the soccer is what my eyes are on. There's also WNBA stuff going on constantly. The home run derby's honestly like a fun one to bet on. I love anytime goal scorers in soccer because you get plus odds on everybody. You can get a little boost. You can get a little better likelihood because soccer can be random. But if you just bet on the best goal scorer on each team, that's pretty solid odds at the end of the day. Colombia, Argentina, Canada, Uruguay, France, all of it. FanDuel, America's number one sportsbook and an official sports betting partner of Major League Baseball. All right, let's close out the show. Let's look ahead as we make the case for the Suns standing pat. All right. Reason number one that this could be a sound strategy in terms of their flexibility going forward is that the deadline could simply be a better time to make a move like the ones we want the Suns to make. Or the only ones they can make might be a better way to put it. Right? Nurkic plus a 2031 draft pick. But I'll also remind you, I think second round picks attached to some salary tend to be easier to trade at the deadline. We see that for multiple years now. We've seen it often, whether that's Rui Hachimura, Jay Crowder, obviously with the Suns, Royce O'Neal, on and on down the line. But on top of that, Nurkic and Nasir Little won't be the only salaries that the Suns have by the time the trade deadline comes around in 7 months or whatever. Grayson Allen will become trade eligible in the fall, and Royce O'Neal will become trade eligible in December, January when all the new signees get added to that mix. Okay, so there's just going to be more options is the bottom line here. And there's tangible proof of that. This past deadline, I know I've mentioned this trade a million times, but let me just do it one more time. PJ Washington for Dallas. They go out of their way to re-swap their pick basically with the Thunder. They turn around, they use that pick, send it to Charlotte, along with Grant Williams, who was basically a version of like what their version of what Royce O'Neal will be for the Suns, just a guy that they thought they wanted, who maybe ends up being more of a trade chip. They attach that pick to Grant, send that out, and get back PJ Washington. Not the only one, though. Terry Rozier, very similar to more maybe of like the Yusuf Nurkic route, but Lowry was fully expiring at that point, so it's a little bit different, but a big salaried player combined with a future first-round pick to bring in a difference maker. That's what Miami did. So those are two different versions of what the Suns could be looking at with Nurkic, Allen, or O'Neal at the deadline, along with having more seconds to trade, with having those second round picks to trade and everything else. Matt Ishbia said, and this is why I still believe that the Suns will be looking, and I would honestly just say, before we fully flush the toilet on this summer and a trade, and I know I keep ringing the bell, but look, even as I'm making the case for them standing pat, I got to be myself. Matt Ishbia said, quote, if fans like to look in the future and say, hey, I really like that 2031 draft pick because maybe that 7th grader is going to be really good and we're going to draft him and one day he's going to be a player, you ain't going to like the Phoenix Suns because we're going to say draft picks are to get great players. So, they told us they wanted to mostly stand pat back in May. They also told us that pick was certainly an opportunity to improve the rest of the roster. So you could say they're talking out of both sides of their mouth. Maybe they are a little bit, but that also just speaks to why I'm not fully moving on from the fact that it could get traded this summer. I'm also fully believing that they will explore trades with that pick in the spring or in the winter at the deadline. Keep an eye on the Utah Jazz, though, as this summer continues, because if they move Lauri Markkanen, not only will that create some ripple effects with other teams' rosters like the Warriors, if the Warriors were to potentially get him, but it will also mean that the Jazz are in full teardown mode, as we assume the Nets are still, right? Why has Cam Johnson and Dorian Finney-Smith not been in rumors? I don't know. So there's still more to be done. The Jazz make sense as a partner because they would love to have another future pick, and they have a lot of salaries that the Suns could absorb. So keep an eye there. Ishbia said the 2031 pick was not some sort of, untouchable asset, but it hasn't gone anywhere yet. The last thing I will say is, actually one more thing on the trade, because I said I would return to it when it comes to Charlotte. I thought, Nick Richards, Grant Williams, there were guys on that, Cody Martin, there were guys on that roster that made some sense. Even Jalen McDaniels, who ended up going, I honestly don't remember, Sacramento? Is that where he plays now? And Charlotte's a perfect example of why the market for the type of trade with Nurkic and a pick that the Suns may have wanted to make was easier said than done. What the Hornets basically did is they entered the offseason with a ton of cap space, more than a lot of other teams had. And if you even go back to last deadline, they did a version of this with, they took back Vasilija Micic from Oklahoma City in the Gordon Hayward trade, which is a little bit more of, obviously Hayward made a lot more money, but it was the fact that Hayward was expiring and Micic had money on the books this year, as did Pokashevsky and Davis Bertans. This summer, and they basically said, instead of taking back a highly paid player like Nurkic, what we're going to do, they also did it with Lowry at the deadline for the Rozier trade. Instead of taking back one expensive player like Nurkic, who really doesn't factor in for us and everything else, what we're going to do is we're going to split that up over some players we either like more or just multiple guys where we can add up more and more assets rather than just one pick or one team's assets. We're going to go in a variety of directions. So what they did is they took back Reggie Jackson from Denver for 3 second-round picks. They took back Devontae Graham from the Spurs, as I mentioned, for, I believe, 1 second-round pick. They took back Josh Green from Dallas for, I don't remember what they got in that trade, a handful of seconds for sure. I don't believe they got a first for it because he's a good player. But at the end of the day, I can't fault them, They get back Josh Green, who is a much better use of money than as a young player who could still get better than Nurkic. They get Micic, who's a good, capable backup point guard dating back to last trade deadline. And then they cut Devontae Graham and Davis Bertans to basically just say, we'll eat the money, but they're not even going to factor into our roster. You can't really do that with Nurkic when he has 2 full years left on his deal. And then, for all we know, Reggie Jackson could still play for them. And he's the only guy that kind of fits that Nurkic mold as maybe in the older camp, although I would say Nurkic is a much better player than Reggie Jackson. But still, when Reggie Jackson only makes $5.2 million, you can get away with it, even if he's just sort of a guy that you trust to go out there and like make some open threes, and then you can deal with that when that's the price tag. So again, I think teams were just a little bit more likely to say, we're going to use our cap space and we can afford to be choosy taking back other teams' mistakes or other teams' bloated contracts rather than doing the Suns a favor just to get this magical 2031 pick. If teams didn't like Nurkic as a player, if teams thought they had better options, if teams just didn't want to deal with that much money and wanted to take smaller bites at that apple, what are the Suns really going to do about that at the end of the day? So the deadline can have those opportunities for them. Last but not least, I think another part of the case for standing pat is this could just be a better team for player development this year here in Phoenix, right? I mean, last year, it's easy to say this in hindsight. I'm not going to pretend, and I don't think I have pretended as I've been talking and beating this drum, but I was all on board with the way that the Suns built out last year's roster. I liked a lot of the guys, but this year, moving away from those mid-prime veterans in favor of higher floor, more experienced, certain, stable depth pieces creates an environment where the players who are here to develop are here to develop. And that's kind of, it just built into the team. Last year, almost everybody was in a competitive environment to grow, earn minutes, beat each other out, right? Where, I mean, even into opening night, it was like, is Nasir Little going to get that other fifth spot? Is Keita Bates-Diop going to become that guy? Who's the backup center? Is Bol Bol going to get any time? Can Jordan Goodwin be the answer of this backup point guard? On and on. Everybody in the mix was fighting for their spot. Now, the vets are the vets. The young guys are the young guys. I'm not saying I can read Mason Plumlee's mind, but in his 30s now, I think he's 34 years old. He's on a minimum contract. He understands the point of his career that he is at. If Oso Ighodaro beats him out by the end of the year for the backup center spot, I do not think there's going to be a bunch of hard feelings. If Monte Morris gets 8 minutes like he just was doing in the playoffs for Minnesota because, Colin Gillespie gets called up out of nowhere and looks like a freak future building block. I mean, I'm just making stuff up, or the Suns trade for another player and that guy supersedes any of these dudes, even Royce O'Neal for that matter, a little bit in the rotation and they lose minutes. I just have a feeling that they've all accomplished enough that it's going to be fine. And in practice, day to day, it's clear. Dunn, Ighodaro, the two-way guys, bottom of the totem pole. Everybody else, somewhere in between. And that's all it's going to be. Bol will likely be in contention for a rotation spot right away. Dunn and Oso have clear ways that they can step in, fill a role, and prove themselves. And it'll all just sort of make a lot more sense. I think also just the fact of not having, remember, Bradley Beal missed all of preseason. Forget the playing. It's also practice time, training, installing stuff, getting comfortable with each other. He missed all of that. The Ayton trade with Nurkic and all that, Allen, those guys came in and had to learn on the fly. Roles were changing rapidly. You can't predict health, but if the Suns have even a normal first half of the season health-wise, even if you assume people will miss some games here and there, the continuity and the role clarity will just be so much better. And you can afford to develop talent this way when you have a full rotation, right? When you don't suddenly have to press guys that are not ready into action. When you have multiple dudes who are veterans who can step in, and even if for some reason Nasir Little, Ryan Dunn, Ighodaro, the two-way players are forced to step in, they're doing it as 9th, 10th men rather than starters, which is what we saw last year. It also helps to have a G League team, by the way. So there you go. More future flexibility. Market didn't develop. The big three in the core has a history of proving that they can be successful together. And everything just makes more sense. There's your case. Hit follow or subscribe. More episodes throughout the week. I'll maybe make the case against it. Not a full episode. I don't want to be a downer, but I'll do a little bit of that tomorrow. We'll keep up with the news in Phoenix and around the NBA as we get ready for Summer League. So hit follow or subscribe if you have not already. Get all that in your feed this week and beyond. And I'll catch you guys tomorrow.